Here's something wild. Everything you think you know about matter, space, and physical reality might trace back to a guy we're not even 100% sure existed. I'm serious. Leucippus, the philosopher we're about to explore, left behind so little evidence that for centuries, scholars actually debated whether he was a real person or just a myth invented by later thinkers. No surviving writings, barely any biographical details, just fragments quoted by other philosophers and a revolutionary idea so powerful it would eventually reshape all of Western science. Think about that for a second. The foundation of atomic theory, the concept that underlies chemistry, physics, our entire understanding of material reality, comes from someone so obscure that historians once wondered if he was made up. But here's what makes this story fascinating. Even if the man is a mystery, his idea is crystal clear. And that idea? It's one of the most audacious intellectual leaps in human history. Leucippus proposed that everything, your body, this room, the stars, your thoughts, is made of tiny, invisible, indivisible particles moving through empty space. In the 5th century BCE, without microscopes, without experiments, without any way to verify this claim, just pure philosophical reasoning. Now, before you think, okay, ancient guy guessed right about atoms, neat. Understand that this wasn't just a lucky guess. Leucippus was solving a specific, mind-bending philosophical crisis. He was responding to arguments so logically tight, so philosophically devastating, that they seemed to prove motion itself was impossible. That change was an illusion. That reality was fundamentally unchanging and indivisible. The philosophers making these arguments, the Eleatics, particularly Parmenides and Zeno, had basically used logic to corner reality into an impossible position. And Leucippus looked at this intellectual trap and said, what if we're thinking about this all wrong? That's what we're diving into today. Not just what Leucippus believed, but why he believed it. The problem he was solving, the revolutionary implications of his solution, and why 2,500 years later, his ghost still haunts every chemistry lab and physics department in the world. All right, let's talk about what we actually know and don't know about this philosophical phantom. Leucippus probably lived in the 5th century BCE. Probably. Most scholars place him somewhere around 460–370 BCE, which makes him a contemporary of Socrates. He was likely from either Miletus or Abdera, two cities that matter more than you might think. Miletus was the birthplace of Greek philosophy itself. Thales, Anaximander, Anaximenes, the first people to ask, what is everything made of? Without invoking gods, they all came from Miletus. So if Leucippus was from there, he's part of this incredible intellectual lineage, this tradition of trying to explain reality through natural principles rather than mythology. Abdera, on the other hand, was in Thrace, the northern frontier of the Greek world. Less culturally central, but it became home to some seriously radical thinkers. And here's what's interesting. Abdera is where Democritus, Leucippus's most famous student, definitely lived and taught. So there's this strong connection. But honestly, we're not certain about any of this. The ancient sources contradict each other. Some later philosophers even claimed Leucippus never existed at all, that Leucippus was just a name Democritus used for his own early writings. Epicurus, the famous Epicurean philosopher who built his entire system on atomism, supposedly denied Leucippus existed. Modern scholarship has mostly settled this debate. The consensus now is, yes, Leucippus was real. The evidence, while fragmentary, is too consistent across too many independent sources for him to be pure invention. Plus, Aristotle and Theophrastus, who were serious scholars, not myth-makers, both attributed atomism to Leucippus specifically, distinguishing him clearly from Democritus. So we're working with a real person, just a really obscure one. Here's what we can say with reasonable confidence. Leucippus was deeply influenced by the Eleatic school of philosophy, particularly by Parmenides and his student Zeno. Now, the Eleatics were based in Elea, a Greek colony in southern Italy, and they had developed this incredibly rigorous, logically tight philosophical system that led to some truly bizarre conclusions. And this is crucial. This is the key to understanding why Leucippus's atomism matters. He wasn't just randomly speculating about invisible particles. He was trying to solve a genuine philosophical crisis. The Eleatics had used pure logic to argue that reality must be singular, unchanging, and eternal. That multiplicity is impossible. That motion is impossible. that the world of change and variety we experience every day is somehow an illusion. These weren't fringe crackpots. These were brilliant thinkers with airtight arguments that nobody could easily refute. Zeno's paradoxes, you know, the one about Achilles never catching the tortoise, or the arrow that can't actually move. These weren't just clever puzzles. They were serious philosophical weapons designed to defend Parmenides' radical vision of reality, and every other philosopher of the era had to deal with them. You couldn't just ignore the Eleatics. Their logic was too good. Most thinkers tried to modify the Eleatic position, or find loopholes, or argue that change was somehow compatible with their framework. Leucippus did something different, something bolder. He said, "Okay, you're right that reality must be eternal and unchanging, but you're wrong about it being singular. What if reality is eternal and unchanging particles, plural, moving through empty space? Then we get the logical rigor you're demanding and the world of change we actually experience. This is philosophical judo, taking your opponent's strength and using it against them. The Eleatics insisted on eternal, unchanging being. Fine. Leucippus gave them eternal, unchanging atoms, lots of them, moving through void. Brilliant. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Leucippus apparently wrote at least 2 works, The Great World System and On Mind. Both are lost, completely gone. We have only fragments quoted by later authors. This is why Democritus, who wrote prolifically and whose works circulated more widely, ended up getting most of the credit for atomism. But those later authors, Aristotle, Theophrastus, Simplicius, they're clear. Leucippus founded atomism. Democritus developed it, expanded it, popularized it. But the core insight? That was Leucippus. So we're looking at a figure who changed the course of Western thought while remaining almost entirely in shadow. A philosopher whose idea outlived his biography, whose theory survived while his texts perished. And honestly, there's something philosophically appropriate about that. Atomism is all about invisible foundations, particles you can't see that explain everything you can see. Maybe it's fitting that its founder is himself barely visible through the mists of history. But that idea, those invisible particles, we need to understand where it came from. And to do that, we need to fully grasp the intellectual crisis Leucippus was responding to. We need to understand why the Eleatics thought motion was impossible. Okay, time to blow your mind a little bit, or maybe a lot. Parmenides, this is mid-5th century BCE, writes this philosophical poem called On Nature. And in it, he makes an argument so radical, so counterintuitive, that it basically traumatized Greek philosophy for generations. Here's his claim. Reality is one. Singular. Eternal. Unchanging. Indivisible. Not reality has one source or everything is connected. No, he means reality is one thing, period. What we perceive as multiple separate objects. Illusion. What we experience as change, motion, birth, death, illusion, all of it. True being, capital B. Being admits no multiplicity, no transformation, no coming to be or passing away. It just is, eternal, perfect, unchanging, like a perfect sphere suspended outside of time. Now, your first reaction is probably, that's insane. I can see multiple things right now. I just moved my hand. Things obviously change, right? I mean, come on. This seems like philosophy disappearing up its own abstract backside, completely divorced from reality. But here's the thing, and this is why the Eleatics were so dangerous. Parmenides doesn't just assert this, he proves it. Or at least he gives arguments so logically tight that nobody could easily refute them. His reasoning goes something like this. For something to come into being, it must come from either being or non-being. If it comes from being, it already exists, so it's not really coming into being. And if it comes from non-being, from nothing, well, that's impossible. Nothing can come from nothing. You can't get something from what doesn't exist. Therefore, nothing can come into being. And by the same logic, nothing can pass away. Being must be eternal. Similarly, for being to be multiple, for there to be separate things, there would have to be something that divides them, something between them. But what could that be? If it's being, then there's no real division. It's all still being. And if it's non-being, if it's nothing, then nothing can't separate anything. Nothing literally cannot exist. Therefore, being must be one, indivisible, and motion? Forget about it. For something to move, it must move into a place where it currently isn't. But that place must be either being or non-being. If it's being, it's already full, there's no room to move into. And if it's non-being, if it's empty space, well, we just established that non-being cannot exist. Therefore, motion is impossible. You see what's happening here? Every step seems logically sound. The conclusions are absurd, but the reasoning is airtight. This is what made the Eleatic challenge so devastating. And then Zeno, Parmenides' student, comes along and makes it worse. So much worse. Zeno develops these paradoxes specifically designed to defend his teacher's position. They're not just brain teasers. They're philosophical weapons meant to show that any alternative to Parmenides leads to logical contradictions. The most famous is the paradox of Achilles and the tortoise. Achilles, swift-footed Achilles, the fastest runner in Greek mythology, races a tortoise. The tortoise gets a head start. Zeno argues that Achilles can never catch up. Why? Because first, Achilles must reach the point where the tortoise started, but by the time he gets there, the tortoise has moved a bit further. So Achilles must reach that new point, but by then the tortoise has moved again. And so on, infinitely. Achilles is always getting closer but can never actually catch up, because there are infinite points he must pass through. Or consider the arrow paradox. An arrow is shot through the air. At any given instant, the arrow occupies a space exactly equal to its length. At that instant, it's not moving. It's just there, occupying that space. But if at every instant the arrow is motionless, and time is made up of instants, then the arrow never actually moves. Motion is an illusion created by stringing together motionless moments. These paradoxes are brilliant, infuriating, but brilliant. They expose deep problems with how we think about space, time, infinity, and motion. Problems that, frankly, weren't fully resolved until calculus was invented in the 17th century. And even then, there are still philosophers and mathematicians arguing about them. But here's what made this an existential crisis for Greek philosophy. The Eleatics weren't just playing intellectual games, they were serious, and their arguments were good enough that you couldn't just dismiss them. The void paradox. And here's where it gets really relevant to Leucippus, because central to the Eleatic position is the denial of void, of empty space. Parmenides explicitly argues, non-being cannot be. What doesn't exist cannot exist. Which sounds tautological until you realize what he means. Emptiness, void, vacuum, these cannot be real. Because void would be nothing, and nothing cannot be. Therefore reality must be completely full, a plenum, no gaps, no spaces, no emptiness anywhere. And this creates a massive problem for explaining the world we experience. Because if reality is completely full, how do things move? How do they separate and combine? How does anything change position? The Eleatics bite the bullet. They don't. It's all illusion. What you think you perceive as motion and change is just your senses deceiving you. Reality itself, true being, is motionless and unchanging. Now other philosophers tried to get around this. Empedocles, for instance, proposed 4 elements, earth, air, fire, water, that mix and separate under the influence of love and strife. But he still denied the void. He argued that these elements move by mutual replacement. Like when you stir water, it flows around your hand by displacing into adjacent spaces. No actual emptiness required. Anaxagoras proposed infinite qualitative differences, seeds of everything mixed together, but again, no void. Everything is full of these seeds. But notice, both of these philosophers are still working within the Eleatic constraint. They're trying to explain change and multiplicity while accepting that void cannot exist. They're trying to solve the problem without violating Parmenides' logical prohibition against non-being. And this is the intellectual landscape Leucippus inherits. Every serious philosopher of his era is grappling with this question. How do you explain the obvious fact of change and motion while respecting the Eleatic arguments against non-being and multiplicity? Most tried to find clever workarounds within the Eleatic framework. They accepted the basic constraint and tried to work around it. Leucippus did something different. Something that must have seemed absolutely scandalous to his contemporaries. He looked at the Eleatic prohibition against void and said, "You're wrong. The void exists. Non-being is real." Not as a casual dismissal, not as, Well, obviously empty space exists, you're being silly. No. He took the Eleatic challenge seriously and then deliberately, carefully, philosophically violated their most fundamental principle. He argued, yes, being is eternal and unchanging. You're right about that. But being exists in the form of indivisible particles, atoms, and between these atoms, void, empty space, non-being. And both are real, both are necessary, both are infinite. This is the move, this is the revolutionary insight. Leucippus accepts half of the Eleatic position, the eternal unchanging nature of fundamental reality, and rejects the other half, the singularity and denial of void. He gives you eternal being in the form of atoms, plural, moving through real, actual emptiness. And suddenly you can explain everything. Motion? Atoms moving through void. Change? Atoms rearranging. Multiplicity? Different combinations of atoms. Birth and death? Atoms coming together and dispersing. All the phenomena the Eleatics dismissed as illusion, Leucippus explains them through the interaction of his two principles, the full and the empty, atoms and void. But here's what makes this philosophically sophisticated rather than just stubborn. Leucippus isn't denying the Eleatic insights about being. He's relocating them. The atoms themselves are Parmenidean being, eternal, unchanging, indivisible. Each atom is a little piece of perfect, unchanging reality. It's just that there are infinite atoms and they move through infinite void. So in a weird way, Leucippus is both agreeing with and completely overturning Parmenides. He's preserving the logical force of the Eleatic arguments while rejecting their conclusions about the nature of reality. And this move, this willingness to assert that void, that non-being is real, this is what makes atomism possible. Without void, you can't have discrete particles. Without void, you can't have motion. Without void, you're stuck trying to explain change in a plenum, which is what everyone else was doing. Leucippus looked at the most powerful logical arguments of his era and said, the problem isn't with change and motion. The problem is with denying empty space. And from that single insight, void is real, he built an entire cosmology, an entire theory of matter, an entire explanation of reality that would eventually turn out to be basically correct. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, we need to understand exactly what Leucippus proposed. What are these atoms? What is this void? How do they work together? That's where we're going next. Alright, here's where Leucippus makes his move. And the elegance of this solution, I mean, it's genuinely beautiful. Remember, he's facing this seemingly impossible challenge. Explain the world of change and motion we actually experience while respecting the Eleatic demand for eternal, unchanging being. Everyone else is trying to thread this needle with increasingly complex theories, multiple elements mixing, infinite seeds, love and strife as cosmic forces. Leucippus says, what if reality has just two fundamental principles? Just two. That's it. The full and the empty. Atoms and void. Let's start with the full. What Leucippus calls atoms. The word atom literally means uncuttable in Greek, atomos, not able to be divided. These are particles of solid eternal matter. Each atom is completely full. No gaps, no internal structure, no parts. You cannot split an atom. You cannot break it down into anything smaller. It is absolutely indivisible. Now, before you start thinking about nuclear fission and, wait, we can split atoms, hold that thought. Leucippus isn't talking about what we call atoms in modern chemistry. He's talking about the ultimate fundamental units of matter, whatever cannot be divided further. If our atoms can be split into protons and neutrons and those into quarks, well, Leucippus would say keep going until you hit something truly indivisible. That's what he means by atom. These atoms are eternal. They never came into being. They've always existed. They will never cease to be. Each atom is a little piece of Parmenidean being, perfect, unchanging, indestructible. But here's the crucial part. The atoms themselves are uniform in substance. They're all made of the same stuff, solid, eternal being. What makes them different from each other is their shape and size. Some atoms are spherical, some are hooked, some are angular, some are smooth, some are large, some are tiny. Infinite variety in form, but uniform in substance. Think of it like every atom is made of the same material, but they come in different shapes like cookie cutters making different forms from the same dough. And these differences in shape matter enormously, because how atoms hook together, how they fit or don't fit, how they combine and separate, that depends on their shapes. A hooked atom can catch on another atom. Smooth atoms slide past each other easily. This is how Leucippus explains why different substances have different properties. Why is water fluid? The atoms are smooth and spherical, rolling over each other. Why is iron hard? The atoms are hooked and angular, locked tightly together. Why does fire burn? Fire atoms are sharp and quick-moving, penetrating other substances. All the diversity of the material world, every texture, every property, every quality you experience, comes down to atoms of different shapes combining in different arrangements. But atoms alone aren't enough. Because if reality were just atoms packed together with no space between them, we'd be back to the Eleatic plenum, no motion, no change, just solid being all the way down. This is where Leucippus makes his scandalous move. He says between the atoms is void, empty space, the empty, non-being, and, here's the key, the void is real. Let that sink in for a second. Leucippus is arguing that nothing is something, that emptiness exists, that non-being has being. This directly contradicts Parmenides' fundamental principle. It's philosophical heresy. And Leucippus knows it. He's not naive about what he's claiming, but he's saying, look, without void, motion is impossible. And motion clearly happens. So either we deny the obvious reality of motion, which is absurd, or we accept that void exists. The void is infinite. It extends in all directions forever, and within this infinite emptiness, infinite atoms move. Now, the void isn't just passive background. It's a fundamental principle of reality, equal in status to the atoms themselves. It's what makes everything else possible. Without void, atoms couldn't move. Without void, they couldn't separate or combine. Without void, there's no space for anything to happen. Think of it this way. Atoms are the what of reality, the stuff things are made of. Void is the where, the space in which atoms can move and interact. Together, these two principles, and only these two, explain everything. All observable change, all the transformation you see in the world, comes from atoms moving through void and rearranging themselves. The atoms themselves never change. They're eternal and unchanging, just like Parmenides demanded, but their arrangements change constantly. When wood burns, the atoms aren't transforming into different atoms. They're separating and recombining with other atoms. When you're born, atoms are gathering together in a particular arrangement. When you die, those atoms disperse. The atoms themselves persist eternally. It's like, imagine you have infinite Lego blocks in infinite space. The blocks themselves never change. They're eternal, indestructible. But you can build infinite different structures by arranging them in different ways. Every object, every substance, everything is just a temporary arrangement of eternal atoms in the void. And this solves the Eleatic problem completely. You get eternal unchanging being, in the form of atoms. And you get the world of change and motion, through atomic rearrangement in void. Leucippus gives you logical rigor and empirical reality. He refuses to choose between them. The sheer audacity of this solution, proposing that nothing is real, that non-being exists, it must have seemed crazy to his contemporaries. But it works. It actually works as an explanation. And here's what's remarkable. Leucippus is proposing this with zero empirical evidence. He can't see atoms. He has no microscope, no experiments, no way to verify this claim. It's pure philosophical reasoning. He's solving a logical problem, and the solution happens to involve invisible particles that won't be confirmed to exist for another 2,400 years. That's not luck. That's philosophical genius. Let's break down the core principles of Leucippan atomism, because each one has massive implications. First, all matter is composed of solid, indivisible atoms separated by empty space. This is the foundation. Everything you see, touch, taste, it's atoms and void, nothing else. No mystical substances, no divine essence, no special life force, just particles and emptiness. And notice, this is a radical departure from every other theory of matter in the ancient world. Thales said everything is water, Anaximenes said air, Heraclitus said fire, Empedocles said 4 elements, and Anaxagoras said infinite qualitative seeds. All of them are proposing continuous substances that can be divided indefinitely. Cut water in half, you get more water. Divide air, you get more air. Leucippus says no. Keep dividing, and eventually you hit something that cannot be divided further. The atom. And that's where reality bottoms out. This is the first truly discrete particulate theory of matter in Western philosophy. Everything is countable. Everything is made of distinct separate units. Reality is fundamentally granular, not continuous, and this has profound implications we're still grappling with today. Is space itself continuous or discrete? Is time? These are live questions in quantum mechanics and relativity. Second, atoms are eternal and homogeneous in substance, but they differ infinitely in shape, size, and arrangement. This is brilliant economy of explanation. One type of substance, eternal being, but infinite variety in form. You don't need 4 elements. You don't need infinite qualitative differences. You just need one kind of stuff in different shapes, and you can explain everything. Why does gold differ from lead? Different atomic arrangements. Why is water different from ice? Same atoms, different arrangement. Why do you differ from a rock? Different atoms and different arrangements. All qualitative differences reduced to quantitative differences, shape, size, position, arrangement. This is the birth of mathematical physics, right here. The idea that all properties can ultimately be explained through geometry and number. And notice the move. Leucippus is taking qualities: hot, cold, wet, dry, hard, soft, and reducing them to quantities. This is a massive conceptual shift. It means the world is fundamentally mathematical, measurable, calculable. Third, every observable change results from atoms rearranging, colliding, and separating. No divine intervention required. This is where atomism becomes truly revolutionary from a philosophical standpoint. Because Leucippus is proposing a completely mechanical universe. There are no gods moving things around, no cosmic intelligence directing events, no purpose or teleology built into nature. Just atoms moving through void according to necessity. When atoms collide, they either bounce off each other or hook together, depending on their shapes. That's it. No intention, no goal, no divine plan. Just mechanical causation. This is the first fully naturalistic, mechanistic explanation of reality in Western thought. Everything that happens because of prior physical causes. Atoms in motion cause other atoms to move. That's the whole story. And this terrified people. Because if the universe is just atoms and void following mechanical necessity, where's the room for free will? For moral responsibility? For the gods? For meaning? These questions would haunt atomism for centuries. Epicurus would later try to introduce a random swerve in atomic motion to make room for free will. The Stoics would reject atomism partly because they wanted a purposeful, rational cosmos. But Leucippus doesn't flinch. Mechanical necessity all the way down. Fourth, the entire cosmos formed from a great vortex of atoms swirling in the void, clustering to create worlds through purely mechanical processes. Now we're getting into cosmology. And this is where Leucippus's theory becomes truly comprehensive. He's not just explaining matter, he's explaining the origin of everything. Picture infinite atoms moving randomly through infinite void. Eventually, by pure chance, a large mass of atoms starts swirling. A vortex forms. Like water going down a drain, but on a cosmic scale. As this vortex spins, atoms separate by size and weight. Heavier atoms get pushed toward the center. Lighter atoms get flung outward. This mechanical sorting process creates differentiation. The heavy atoms in the center cluster together, forming Earth. The lighter atoms form water, air, fire. The lightest atoms get flung to the outermost edge, where their friction creates heat. These become the stars. No creator god needed, no intelligent design, just atoms, void, and vortex motion. The cosmos self-organizes through purely mechanical processes. And here's what's wild. This is basically an ancient version of nebular hypothesis, the idea that solar systems form from rotating clouds of matter, which is actually how solar systems form. Leucippus is getting the basic mechanism right 2,400 years before modern astronomy. But wait, it gets better. Leucippus doesn't think there's just one cosmos. He thinks there are infinite cosmoses. Because if you have infinite atoms in infinite void moving randomly, then vortices will form everywhere, constantly. Some cosmoses are being born right now. Others are dying. Throughout infinite space, infinite worlds exist at various stages of development. This is multiverse theory. In the 5th century BCE, and all of it follows necessarily from just two principles, atoms and void. That's the power of this theory. From two simple postulates, you can derive an explanation for literally everything: matter, motion, change, cosmic formation, the diversity of substances, the plurality of worlds. It's reductive in the best sense. It shows how complexity emerges from simplicity, how infinite variety arises from simple rules. And methodologically, this sets the template for all of science. Find the simplest principles that can explain the most phenomena. Reduce complexity to underlying mechanisms, explain the visible through the invisible. Leucippus is doing science before science exists as a discipline. But he's not working alone, because everything we've just discussed, all of this gets developed, expanded, and popularized by his most famous student. Time to talk about Democritus. Here's where the story gets a little bittersweet, because we're about to meet the student who became more famous than his teacher. So much more famous that he nearly erased Leucippus from history entirely. Democritus of Abdera, born around 460 BCE, died around 370 BCE, roughly contemporary with Socrates, though they apparently never met. And unlike his teacher Leucippus, Democritus left a massive footprint on ancient philosophy. The guy was prolific. Ancient sources credit him with over 70 works covering everything from physics and cosmology to ethics, mathematics, music, and even agriculture. He wrote about the nature of the soul, the theory of knowledge, the foundation of morality, the proper way to live. He was called the laughing philosopher because of his cheerful disposition and his view that happiness comes from tranquility of mind. And here's the thing. Democritus took Leucippus's atomic theory and ran with it. He expanded it, refined it, applied it to domains Leucippus never explored. He made atomism into a complete philosophical system, not just a theory of matter, but a comprehensive worldview covering physics, psychology, epistemology, and ethics. The result? When later philosophers talked about atomism, they usually talked about Democritus. His name became synonymous with the theory. His work circulated widely in the ancient world. Meanwhile, Leucippus faded into obscurity. It's the classic academic tragedy: the teacher who has the original insight, the student who develops and popularizes it, and history remembering the student while the teacher becomes a footnote. There's even this slightly painful detail. Epicurus, who built his entire philosophical system on atomism a century later, apparently denied that Leucippus ever existed. He claimed Democritus invented atomism. Now, this might have been Epicurus trying to strengthen his own claim to originality by reducing his intellectual predecessors. Or maybe he genuinely didn't know about Leucippus because the works had already been lost. Either way, imagine being so obscure that later philosophers literally debate whether you were real. But here's what we do know. Leucippus and Democritus collaborated. They apparently co-authored at least two works: The Great World System and On Mind. Both are now lost, surviving only in fragments and references by later authors. And those later authors, particularly Aristotle and his student Theophrastus, are clear about the attribution. Aristotle, who was a serious scholar and had access to works we don't, consistently credits Leucippus as the founder of atomism. He distinguishes Leucippus's contributions from Democritus's developments. He treats them as separate thinkers, with Leucippus coming first. Theophrastus does the same. So does Simplicius, centuries later, who had access to Theophrastus's writings. The ancient scholarly consensus: Leucippus invented atomism, Democritus expanded it. So what did Democritus add? What did he develop beyond Leucippus's original theory? First, he worked out the epistemological implications. Leucippus explained what things are made of. Democritus asked, how do we know about things? How does perception work in an atomic universe? His answer: all perception happens through atoms. When you see something, tiny atoms, idola, images, stream off the object and enter your eye. These image atoms are extremely fine, moving through the air until they strike your eye atoms, and that collision creates the sensation of sight. Same with all the other senses. Taste: food atoms of different shapes strike your tongue atoms. Smooth atoms taste sweet. Sharp atoms taste bitter. Smell: odor atoms entering your nose. Sound: air atoms vibrating and striking your ear. Everything reduces to atoms in motion. Even consciousness itself is atomic. Which brings us to psychology. Democritus proposed that the soul consists of special atoms, Spherical, extremely fine and fast-moving. These soul atoms are distributed throughout the body, and they're what give us life and consciousness. We maintain these soul atoms through breathing. We inhale fresh soul atoms and exhale depleted ones. When we die, the soul atoms disperse. There's no afterlife, no immortal soul. You're just a temporary arrangement of atoms, including soul atoms. And when that arrangement breaks apart, you cease to exist. This is hardcore materialism. Consciousness is physical. Thought is atomic motion. There's nothing supernatural about the mind, it's just a particularly complex arrangement of matter. And ethically, Democritus drew radical conclusions from this. If the soul is mortal, if there's no afterlife, if the gods don't intervene in human affairs, then the goal of life can't be pleasing the gods or preparing for the afterlife. Instead, Democritus argued for euthymia, cheerfulness, tranquility of mind. The good life is the peaceful life. Moderate your desires, avoid excessive ambition, cultivate contentment. Be cheerful. Hence, the laughing philosopher. This ethical vision would deeply influence Epicurus, who built an entire philosophy around the pursuit of ataraxia, freedom from disturbance. But that's Democritus's development, not necessarily Leucippus's. See what happened? Leucippus gave us the physics. Democritus gave us the complete system. Physics, psychology, epistemology, ethics, all integrated through atomism. And honestly, this is how philosophy often works. One thinker has the revolutionary insight. The next generation develops it into a comprehensive worldview. Newton said he stood on the shoulders of giants. Democritus stood on Leucippus's shoulders. The tragedy is just that the shoulders became invisible while everyone looked at what was standing on them. But we know Leucippus was there. And his contribution, that original insight about atoms and void, that's what made everything else possible. Let's dive deeper into how atomism explains literally everything, including things you wouldn't expect atoms to explain. The atomic soul. This is where atomism gets really provocative, because Democritus applies the atomic theory to consciousness itself, and the implications are, well, they're still controversial today. The soul, psyche in Greek, consists of spherical atoms. Why spherical? Because spheres are the most mobile shape. They roll easily, they move quickly. And the soul needs to be mobile because it animates the body, it moves through the body, it responds rapidly to stimuli. These soul atoms are also extremely fine, much smaller than the atoms that make up flesh or bone. They can penetrate throughout the body, distributed in every part. That's how the soul can control movement, sensation, and thought across the entire organism. And here's the crucial part. These soul atoms are fire-like. They're hot and active. Life is associated with heat, death with cold. When you're alive, your soul atoms are moving vigorously, generating heat. When you die, they disperse and you grow cold. We maintain our soul through respiration. This is a brilliant move by Democritus. He's explaining why breathing is necessary for life through atomic theory. When we breathe, we inhale fresh soul atoms from the air. When we exhale, we expel depleted soul atoms. It's like constantly replenishing our supply. This is why holding your breath eventually kills you. You're not refreshing your soul atoms. It's why suffocation is fatal. You're losing soul atoms faster than you can replace them. And when we finally die, when breathing stops permanently, the soul atoms disperse completely into the surrounding air. They don't go to an afterlife. They don't persist as a coherent entity. They just scatter, becoming part of the general atomic flux. You are your atoms. When those atoms disperse, you cease to be. There is no immortal soul, no afterlife, no persistence of personal identity beyond death. This is materialist psychology in its purest form. Consciousness is not some supernatural addition to matter. It is matter, a particular arrangement of particularly fine mobile atoms. And this raises profound questions we're still grappling with. If consciousness is just atoms in motion, is there free will? How do we explain subjective experience, qualia, the what it's likeness of seeing red or feeling pain? Can we reduce mental states to physical states without losing something essential? These are live debates in contemporary philosophy of mind. Democritus was raising them 2,400 years ago. Infinite cosmoses. Now let's zoom out, way out, to the cosmic scale. Leucippus and Democritus don't think our world is the only world. They think there are infinite cosmoses scattered throughout infinite void. Here's the reasoning. You have infinite atoms moving randomly through infinite void. Eventually, by pure statistical necessity, large groups of atoms will collide and start swirling together, forming vortices. Each vortex becomes a cosmos. These cosmoses are at different stages of development. Some are just forming, atoms beginning to swirl and cluster. Some are mature, like ours, with earth, water, air, fire, and celestial bodies all differentiated. Some are dying, their atomic structures breaking down, dispersing back into the void. And this process is eternal. Cosmoses are constantly being born and dying throughout infinite space and time. There's no first cosmos, no final cosmos. Just an eternal cycle of cosmic generation and destruction. This is mind-blowing for multiple reasons. First, it's multiverse theory. The idea that our universe isn't unique, that there are countless other universes out there. This was speculative science fiction until recently. Now it's a serious hypothesis in cosmology. Second, it removes any special status from our world. We're not the center of anything. We're not divinely created or uniquely important. We're just one cosmos among infinite cosmoses, formed by the same mechanical processes that form all the others. Third, it suggests that life might exist elsewhere. If there are infinite cosmoses, and if life arises through atomic combination, then statistically life must exist in other cosmoses too. The atomists don't develop this idea explicitly, but it's implicit in their framework. Atomic whirlpools. Let's get specific about how a cosmos forms, because this is where the atomic theory shows its explanatory power. Start with atoms moving randomly through void. By chance, a large group of atoms begins swirling. Maybe they collide in a way that creates rotational motion. This swirl becomes self-reinforcing. More atoms get caught in the vortex. It grows. As the vortex spins, atoms separate by size and weight. This is key. The mechanical motion of the whirlpool naturally sorts atoms. The heaviest atoms, the largest, densest ones, get pushed toward the center by the centripetal force. They cluster together, compressing, forming a solid mass. This becomes Earth. Medium-weight atoms form a layer around the Earth. This becomes water. Lighter atoms rise above that. Air. The lightest atoms get flung to the outermost edge of the vortex. And here's where it gets clever. These outermost atoms are moving so fast, and they're colliding so frequently, that the friction generates heat. They become fiery. These become the stars, not divine beings, not eternal fires tended by gods, but atoms heated by friction at the edge of a cosmic whirlpool. The sun and moon, also atomic structures caught in the vortex, glowing from heat and friction. Everything in the cosmos, from the earth beneath your feet to the stars above your head, is just atoms arranged by mechanical vortex motion. No creator needed, no intelligent design, no cosmic purpose, just atoms, void, and the necessary consequences of vortex motion. And this mechanism, this explanation of cosmic formation through rotating matter, is essentially correct. Obviously the details are wrong. Stars aren't friction-heated atoms at the edge of a vortex. But the basic idea that cosmic structures form from rotating clouds of matter, that's how solar systems actually form. Nebular hypothesis confirmed by modern astronomy. Leucippus and Democritus got the fundamental mechanism right through pure philosophical reasoning. Think about what they're doing here. They're explaining the origin and structure of the entire cosmos using only atoms and void. No gods, no purposes, no mystical forces. Just particles and empty space following mechanical necessity. This is the birth of scientific cosmology. The idea that you can explain the universe through natural laws and physical processes. That you don't need supernatural explanations for cosmic phenomena, and it's all built on that original Leucippan insight. Reality consists of atoms moving through void. From two simple principles, the full and the empty, you can explain matter, motion, change, life, consciousness, and the origin of worlds. That's the power of atomism. That's why this theory survived, evolved, and eventually became the foundation of modern science. But we need to step back and appreciate just how radical all of this was in its historical context. Okay, let's pause and really appreciate what just happened here. Because it's easy to hear atoms and void and think, yeah, okay, ancient guy guessed right about particles, and miss just how revolutionary this entire framework was. First, this is the first fully materialist vision of reality in Western philosophy. Think about what this means. Every previous Greek philosopher, every single one, had some element of the divine or the mystical in their system. Thales said, everything is water, but he also said, All things are full of gods. Anaximenes proposed air as the fundamental substance, but air was also divine breath, pneuma. Heraclitus had his cosmic fire, but it was also the logos, divine reason ordering the universe. Pythagoras? Everything is number, but numbers are mystical, sacred. Empedocles had love and strife as cosmic forces, personified quasi-divine powers. Even Anaxagoras, who came close to pure naturalism, proposed mind, nous, as the organizing principle that set the cosmos in motion. An intelligent, purposeful force. Leucippus and Democritus? No gods, no divine principles, no cosmic intelligence, no mystical forces, no purposes built into nature, just atoms and void, matter and space. That's it. That's reality. Everything that happens through mechanical necessity. Atoms move, collide, combine, separate, cause and effect, all the way down. No room for divine intervention, no need for supernatural explanation. This is hardcore naturalism. The universe is a machine. A vastly complex machine, sure, but fundamentally mechanical. And you can understand it through reason and observation, not through prayer or revelation. This was scandalous, genuinely scandalous. Because if there are no gods directing events, what happens to religion? What happens to morality? What happens to meaning and purpose? The atomists bit the bullet. There is no cosmic purpose. The universe doesn't care about you. Events happen through mechanical necessity, not divine will. You're born, you live, you die, your atoms disperse. That's the whole story. And yet, and this is crucial, this doesn't lead to nihilism or despair. Democritus was called the laughing philosopher. Epicurus, who built on atomism, advocated for pleasure and tranquility. The atomists said, precisely because there's no afterlife, no divine judgment, no cosmic purpose, you're free. Free to pursue happiness, to live well, to enjoy existence. But that's a later development. The point here is, Leucippus gave us the first completely materialist metaphysics in Western thought. Everything is physical. Everything is explicable through natural processes. That's the foundation of all modern science. Second, atomism rejected both mysticism and continuous substance theories. This is subtle but important. Leucippus wasn't just rejecting supernatural explanations, he was also rejecting the dominant physical theories of his time. Most Greek philosophers proposed continuous substances, water, air, fire. These can be divided indefinitely. Cut water in half, you get more water. There's no fundamental unit, no bottom level. Even Anaxagoras, who proposed infinite qualitative differences, thought matter was infinitely divisible. There are seeds of everything in everything, all the way down. Leucippus said, no, there is a bottom level. Reality is fundamentally discrete, not continuous. It's made of countable, indivisible units, atoms. This is a profound conceptual shift. Because if matter is discrete, then reality is fundamentally mathematical. You can count atoms, you can measure their arrangements. Properties become quantifiable. And this makes the universe knowable in a completely new way, not through mystical insight or divine revelation, but through observation, measurement, calculation. Leucippus is proposing that reality has a structure we can discover through reason, that nature follows rules we can understand, that the visible world is explicable through invisible principles. This is the birth of the scientific worldview. The idea that there are natural laws, that phenomena have physical causes, that we can understand the universe through systematic inquiry. Third, atomism anticipated modern scientific understanding by millennia, and here's where it gets really wild, because Leucippus was basically right, not in every detail, obviously. Modern atoms aren't indivisible. They have internal structure. They're not solid particles. Quantum mechanics tells us they're more like probability clouds. The void isn't just empty space, it's seething with quantum fluctuations. But the fundamental insight? Reality consists of discrete particles moving through space. All observable phenomena result from these particles combining and recombining. All properties reduced to arrangement and motion. That's basically correct. Leucippus proposed this in the 5th century BCE. Atomism was confirmed experimentally in the early 20th century CE. That's a 2,400-year gap between hypothesis and verification. Think about that. A philosopher sitting in ancient Greece with zero technology, no experiments, no way to observe atoms, develops a theory that turns out to be fundamentally accurate. That's not luck. That's the power of philosophical reasoning. That's what happens when you take logic seriously, when you follow arguments where they lead, when you're willing to propose invisible entities to explain visible phenomena. And the parallels are eerie. Leucippus said atoms differ in shape and size. Modern chemistry says molecular structure determines properties. Leucippus said all change is rearrangement. Modern chemistry confirms that chemical reactions are atoms recombining. Leucippus said the cosmos formed from a vortex. Modern astronomy says solar systems form from rotating nebulae. He got the basic mechanisms right. Now we have to be careful here. This isn't ancient wisdom mysteriously knowing modern science. Leucippus didn't know about electrons or quantum mechanics or chemical bonds. His atoms are philosophically motivated, not empirically discovered, but the fact that philosophical reasoning led him to a framework that would later be empirically confirmed, that tells us something important about the power of rational inquiry, about the ability of human thought to penetrate beneath surface appearances and grasp underlying structure. Fourth, atomism challenged every orthodoxy of its era. And let's not underestimate the courage this required, because Leucippus wasn't just proposing a new theory, he was attacking the foundations of Greek thought. Against Parmenides, the most logically rigorous philosopher of the era, he asserted that void exists, that non-being is real. Philosophical heresy. Against common sense and everyday experience, he claimed that everything is made of invisible particles we can never see, that solid objects are mostly empty space. That reality is radically different from how it appears. Against religious tradition, he removed the gods from any explanatory role, made them unnecessary, reduced divine action to atomic motion. Against teleological thinking, the idea that nature has purposes, he proposed pure mechanism. No goals, no ends, no cosmic plan. Every move is controversial. Every claim is radical. And Leucippus makes them all calmly, systematically, as if they're obvious conclusions from clear premises. That takes intellectual courage, the willingness to follow logic wherever it leads, even if it contradicts everything people believe, even if it makes you unpopular, even if it seems absurd. And that's the model for all subsequent science. Follow the evidence. Follow the arguments. Don't let tradition or authority or common sense stop you from pursuing truth. If the logic leads to invisible particles moving through void, so be it. If it leads to infinite cosmoses, so be it. If it leads to a mechanical, godless universe, so be it. Truth over comfort. Understanding over convention, that's the atomist legacy. So why are we spending all this time on an obscure 5th century BCE philosopher whose works are lost and whose existence was once debated? Because Leucippus matters, not just as a historical footnote, but as a living influence on how we think about reality. Scientific foundation. Every time you learn chemistry, you're building on Leucippin foundations. The periodic table? That's atoms differing in structure. Chemical reactions? Atoms recombining? States of matter? Atoms in different arrangements. Every time physicists talk about fundamental particles, quarks, leptons, bosons, they're working in a framework Leucippus pioneered. The idea that complex reality reduces to simple, indivisible units. Every time cosmologists model galaxy formation or solar system development, they're using principles Leucippus intuited: matter clustering through mechanical processes, structures emerging from rotation and gravity. Modern science is atomistic to its core. We explain the macro through the micro. We reduce complexity to simple elements and interactions. We look for the invisible mechanisms underlying visible phenomena. That's all Leucippus. That entire approach to understanding nature. That's his legacy. And it's not just that he happened to guess right. It's that he established a methodology. Propose invisible entities if they explain visible phenomena. Trust logic and reason over immediate perception. Seek the simplest principles that account for the most data. That's how science works. That's the scientific method in embryo. Historical influence. But the influence isn't just conceptual, it's a direct historical lineage. Leucippus taught Democritus. Democritus influenced Epicurus. Epicurus taught his followers in Athens. One of those followers, or someone in that tradition, taught Lucretius, and Lucretius wrote De Rerum Natura, On the Nature of Things, a beautiful Latin poem explaining atomism in detail. This work survived the fall of Rome. It was rediscovered in the Renaissance, and when Renaissance thinkers read Lucretius, they encountered atomism. Gassendi revived atomic theory in the 17th century, explicitly drawing on Lucretius and Democritus. Boyle, Newton, and other early modern scientists engaged with atomism. The atomic theory that emerged in modern chemistry and physics didn't come from nowhere. It came from this tradition. From Leucippus through Democritus, through Epicurus, through Lucretius, through Renaissance revival, through modern science. It's an unbroken chain of intellectual transmission spanning 2,500 years. And that chain starts with Leucippus, with his radical claim that reality is atoms and void. Philosophical relevance. But beyond science, atomism remains philosophically vital, because the debates it sparked are still live. Materialism versus dualism. Is everything physical, or is there something non-physical, mind, soul, consciousness, that can't be reduced to matter? The atomists said everything is physical. Many philosophers today still disagree. This debate is ongoing in philosophy of mind. Reductionism versus emergence. Can you explain complex phenomena entirely through their simple components, or do new properties emerge at higher levels that can't be predicted from lower levels? Atomism is radically reductionist. Everything reduces to atoms and void. But is that right? Does consciousness emerge from but transcend atomic interactions? Determinism versus free will. If everything is atoms following mechanical necessity, are we free? Or is free will an illusion? Epicurus tried to solve this with his atomic swerve, a random deviation in atomic motion. Modern quantum mechanics introduces genuine randomness. But does randomness give us freedom or just replace determinism with chance? Meaning in a mechanical universe. If the cosmos has no purpose, if we're just temporary arrangements of atoms, where does meaning come from? The existentialists grappled with this. Camus, Sartre, they're working through implications of a godless mechanical universe. That's the atomist legacy. These aren't just abstract puzzles. They're questions about how to live, what to value, who we are. And they all trace back to that original atomist move. Removing purpose and divinity from nature, making reality purely mechanical. We're still figuring out what that means. The power of questioning. But maybe the deepest lesson is this. Leucippus shows us the transformative power of questioning assumptions. Everyone in his era accepted certain things as obvious. That void cannot exist. That being must be one. That the gods must play some role in explaining nature. Leucippus questioned all of it, not out of contrarianism, but because the logic demanded it, because the arguments led there. And by questioning what everyone else took for granted, he opened up entirely new ways of understanding reality. That's what philosophy does at its best. It questions the obvious. It challenges the taken for granted. It asks, but what if we're wrong about this fundamental assumption? And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, that questioning leads to breakthrough, to genuine insight, to seeing reality in a completely new way. We need that today. We need people willing to question our current assumptions, to ask whether the frameworks we're using are really adequate, to propose radical alternatives. What are the contemporary equivalents of void cannot exist? What assumptions are we making that future generations will find quaint or obviously wrong? Maybe consciousness can't be reduced to physical processes. Maybe space-time isn't fundamental. Maybe the universe is a simulation. Maybe there are forms of matter or energy we haven't conceived. I don't know. But I know we need people willing to think the unthinkable, to propose the seemingly absurd, to follow logic into uncomfortable territory. That's the spirit of Leucippus, that willingness to question everything in pursuit of truth. And that never goes out of style. So yeah, this obscure philosopher whose works are lost and whose life is a mystery, he matters. He matters because he changed how we think about reality. He matters because his ideas are still shaping science and philosophy. He matters because he showed what intellectual courage looks like. From atoms and void, everything follows. From one radical question, what if non-being is real? An entire worldview emerges. That's the power of philosophy. That's why we study these ancient thinkers. Not for historical curiosity, but because they're still teaching us how to think.